Welcome everybody to the Econ Playground. Today I'm going to be trying something kind of new. I'm going to be doing sort of a PowerPoint video presentation of a essay that I recently wrote. This is the kind of content I'm going to be experimenting with over the next couple months, so we'll see how it goes. But this is a paper that I wrote recently for the Carl Menger Essay Contest called Who Now Speaks of the Armenians? Mass Deportation as a Homogenization Technology in the Late Ottoman Empire. So disclaimer, if you didn't know, I'm half Armenian on my mother's side, so that gave me the natural inclination to research this kind of project. So let's start. Accordingly, I have placed my death head formations in readiness, for the present only in the east, with orders to them to send to the death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language. Only thus shall we gain the living space which we need. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? This was, of course, Adolf Hitler in 1939. And what he was speaking about is what's sort of shown in this map. This is a map of Anatolia, 1914 to 1917, based on the census of those years. And each circle represents a region, and the size of the circle represents the number of Armenians that were living in that region in 1914. And the black is the percentage of Armenians that were not recorded, that were there in 1914, and the red is for Armenians counted in native provinces. The blue is for Armenians deported and accounted for elsewhere. So as you can see, many Armenians were killed. In this figure, it's they approximate about 850,000, but some estimates go up to 1 or 1.2 million. So as you can see, many Armenians died. Mostly in the east is where many Armenians lived, and also, if you can tell, there's a lot more black in these regions. So a lot more Armenians were killed in the areas that Armenians were more heavily concentrated. And this region here would be the one that included my family. They escaped from a village, the mountain Musada here, and they escaped down to Egypt. So that's just my little thing. And most Armenians were deported into this region, into the Syrian desert, where they were just usually just left to die. So this is my basic thesis. The late Ottoman Empire, threatened by modernization and industrialization of the West, was forced to develop the strength of their state by some means. The persecution and genocide of non-Muslim minorities in the late Ottoman Empire is an example of a homogenization technology to prevent the partition of the state and to develop a loyal voter base for a modernizing and secularizing world. So this is the basic framework that I'm going to be using, is the framework in North Wallace and Weingast 2009, and Persecution and Toleration by Noel Johnson and Mark Koyama, which just came out earlier this year. And an important concept that they use is the idea of an identity rule versus a general rule. An identity rule is a institution that sort of applies selectively to you based on some identitarian metric, something like race, religion, or gender, or social class. And a general rule, in purpose at least, is supposed to apply to everyone the same. So an example of an identity rule would be Jim Crow laws, and an example of a general rule would be traffic laws. And an important point that North Wallace and Weingast make in their book is that general rules are very conducive to interpersonal trade, and so general rules generally encourage long-distance trade and for the division of labor to increase, and they're generally good for economic development. So the dichotomy that they make is between natural states and open access orders, natural states being predominantly ruled by identity rules, and open access orders being characterized mostly by general rules. And now what Johnson and Koyama do in Persecution and Toleration is they apply this simple framework and then change it around a bit and apply it to religion. And they also come up with these two self-reinforcing equilibria. The first being conditional toleration, the second being general toleration. So another concept that's important in the economic history literature is that of state capacity. State capacity being approximately how strong your state is, how easy it is for them to enforce laws and collect taxes and do the things that they need to do to be a state. So identity rules and low state capacity go together. Why? Because identity rules are very cheap to enforce. So a smaller state is much more likely to enforce them. And so if you have a small state, they're only going to be able to use something like identity rules. So that's going to encourage identity rules. And then coming back around, identity rules, since they don't facilitate a lot of economic growth, they're not going to facilitate the growth of the state itself. So you kind of get this vicious cycle going on here. Whereas the other equilibrium is if you have a strong state, they're able to enforce general rules, and the general rules encourage the economy grows, and it reinforces the state, and it grows in this virtuous cycle. So how do you transition from one equilibrium to the other equilibrium? Well, that's what persecution and toleration is about, so why don't you go pick it up. The other thinker that I'm going to be looking at or using his ideas is Alessandro Alesina. So one of his papers on the number and size of nations is asking the simple question, how do we reach sort of an equilibrium number and size of nations? An equilibrium, number of nations and then size in terms of population. So he says there's an upward pressure on nations, and that nations naturally want to grow just by the fact that a larger population is better because you have a larger tax base. Public goods are going to be cheaper per person, assuming a fixed cost, and then as you have more people, you have more natural resources, more access, more people within your borders is better than not, just for efficiency's sake, for the division of labor to increase. And then there's a downward pressure on the size of a nation in the fact that if you have a large population, it's more likely that there's going to be a heterogeneity of ideologies, religions, preferences, and it's going to be, one, harder for people to get along, and two, it's going to be harder for the government to satisfy everyone. So people will maybe try to rebel, try to separate from the nation, and they also just might not be as effective. They might not work as well with one another. The next paper by Alesina is published in 2013 on nation building and homogenization technology. So this is the simple idea that just because you have a state and borders doesn't mean you have a nation, doesn't mean you have a group of people that identify with that nation. So he talks a lot about 19th century Europe, places like Italy and Germany, which are just forming as nation states, or as states, but they're not nation states. They don't have a German identity or an Italian identity, so they kind of need to manufacture them. So the idea is that when a nation is transitioning into a democracy, the elite class is going to want to homogenize the people so that when there's a transition to democracy, they just vote for them anyway. So there isn't as big of a transition here at all. So they do a bunch of empirical research, and they find that compulsory education is their example of a homogenization technology. So a homogenization technology is just something that turns the people from a group of diverse, in terms of religion or ethnicity or something like that, a diverse group into a homogeneous group, one that can be more easily controlled or more easily made to unite under this state. So and compulsory education is the example that they use of that, where all the children are taught the same language, they pledge allegiance to the same flag, they sing the same songs, they learn the same history, they learn the same philosophy, religion, etc., etc. And so compulsory education would, in a sense, homogenize the people. So they find an empirical link between compulsory education and transitions to democracy. So what I'm going to be kind of doing originally is remodeling a homogenization technology, but if a genocide as an example of homogenization technology, which in some ways it certainly is. If you're destroying a people group, you're more homogenizing the nation. But I think there's a couple differences than with their paper. So this is a very simple model that I've built, where we've got three costs of this homogenization technology here, as genocide. So the military cost, the actual cost of the resources that you're expending on enforcing this genocide. P is the population cost. Remember back to on the number and size of nations paper, we want a larger population for various reasons. So if you're killing a group of your people, you are eliminating them from the population. This isn't a problem that you have with compulsory education. You're changing people. In a genocide, you're eliminating people. And then R is the potential resistance cost, the potential cost from people resisting against the revolt and destroying resources, etc., etc. And then HG is what we're going to call the gain from homogenization. Along some terms, it's unclear. It would be something like how many more public goods are you able to produce? It's very hard to estimate, but it's a very esoteric thing that you still might want to be weighing against whatever these costs are. So this is our simple equation. If HG, the gain from homogenization, is greater than these three costs, then it's possible, at least, for the people to, or whoever the state, to choose to execute a genocide. So now I'm going to go into some of the basic history of the Ottoman Empire. First, way back, this is for a majority of the Ottoman Empire when they were in the conditional toleration equilibrium. They had something called the Millet System. So after the Pact of Umar, the Ottoman Empire was split up into many smaller millets, which is, a millet means nation. So the Ottoman Empire was one empire, but it was made out of many separate nations. So the Ottoman Empire was legitimized by its Islamic ruler, the Sultan. And in a millet, you could have non-Muslims living, but they were under different conditions. And these people were called dhimmis. They were barred from military and government capacities, and they had to pay an extra jizya tax. So this is what we call the conditional toleration equilibrium. The fact that non-Muslims had to be dhimmis and they had to have their own millets is the example of the identity rules. Now, in the millets, they could sort of run their own lives to some degree, but they were separated and they did have to pay extra taxes. And this kept the Ottoman Empire for a very long time in this vicious cycle, as we see here. But meanwhile, in the West, all kinds of things are going on, and the West is able to slowly start transitioning into the general toleration equilibrium, or just the open access order that North Wallis and Weingast talk about. They develop modern institutions, credible commitments, general rules, and along with this, as their state grows, their military grows a lot, and this becomes a major threat to the Ottoman Empire. Just as a note, for the purpose of this presentation, whenever I mention the West, I'm including Russia, because, and in fact, oftentimes Russia is very highlighted because Russia is in close proximity to the Ottoman Empire, and they had a lot of tension between one another. But the Ottoman Empire begins to become very afraid of the West and what they might do, and they begin to become afraid that the West wants to partition up the Ottoman Empire. Another thing that's happening along with the rise of the West is the rise of the minorities in the Ottoman Empire. So there is a program, or a system called the consular system, where a Western sort of diplomat or consul could come in and set up a Western consulate. So there was an American consulate, British consulate, French consulate, and what they could do is essentially they could take a non-Muslim person in the Ottoman Empire and sort of have them be almost translate their citizenship to a Western citizen. So they would become a sort of a foreign native. And what these people were called were dragomans, which is from the Arabic word targaman for translator. So you can think of these people as sort of legal translators. They're translating the Ottoman economy into Western law. And this is documented by Timur Kuran in his book The Long Divergence. And so this is the number of Muslims. Sorry, get this thing out of the way. This is the number of Muslims as opposed to non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire in 1912, I believe this is, and then how many are traders and how many are Muslims. Most traders, 66% of traders are Christian, Greek, or Armenian, and only 15% are Muslims. So most trade that's going on with the West is happening through these non-Muslim minorities that are these sort of economic translators. And this allows them to grow very rapidly economically in the 18th, 19th centuries. And this also means that they start to come into contact with Western ideas. And the consuls later on are actually going to be one of the major witnesses to the atrocities of the genocide and other things that were going on in the West. So they're actually quite an important player in this story. So the Tanzimat period is sort of the first attempt in the Ottoman Empire to transition to a general toleration equilibrium. Usually the period from 1839 to 1876 is called the Tanzimat period, which Tanzimat just means reform, if I understand that correctly. So in the Tanzimat period, restrictions were being lowered on the dhimmi status, the Millet System was beginning to be dismantled, and the Tanzimat period culminated in the Constitution of 1876, which placed strict restrictions on the Sultan. So it seemed like Turkey was modernizing, was moving towards what we normally consider to be a Western nation, or a sort of a modern Western liberal democracy or something like that. But the reason that the Ottoman Empire didn't develop this much earlier, like in England, is because there was no major landowning class to challenge the Sultan. So it was the Sultan and then all of the peasants. There was no sort of intermediating landowning barons class that was going to challenge the Sultan in any serious way. And so along with this, however, the minority communities began to awake. So the Greeks led a successful independence movement in the 1830s, for example, and the Armenian Millet was able to establish their own national assembly. So there was a smaller parliament for the Armenians within the Armenian Millet, and actually they had their document said that they were establishing the sort of Armenian National Assembly, but the Ottoman document said that it was the regulations of the Armenian Millet. So you can sort of see an identity rule tension there. Another thing that was happening was more Western ideas were breaking into the Ottoman Empire, for example, Protestantism, and this was affecting the Armenian Christian church a lot. The Armenian church and the Armenian Millet was run by the church, and the Armenians mostly focused around, or they centered around their religion as a focal point for their identity, even more so than other ethnic characteristics. In terms of other cultural identifiers, they blend in closer with the Turks or other Middle Eastern groups, but religion is what makes Armenians very clearly and separately distinct from other Middle Eastern groups. So when the Armenian church began to splinter, the ethnicity became a lot shakier. So an Armenian sort of national identity began to arise to sort of be a new focal point for Armenians in the Middle East. So then what happened next was the Abdulhamid II, the Sultan in 1877, suspended the constitution in order to suppress revolts that were going on in Bulgaria, another one of the minority communities that is arising. And this is the effective end of the Tanzimat era. Abdulhamid sort of trashes the constitutions. There's no need for it anymore. He pushes it to the side, and he becomes the ruler. And also at the same time, because of some of the wars that are going on in the surrounding regions, either with minority communities that are awakening, Kurdish refugees begin to move into Anatolia, into eastern Anatolia, and they begin to ransack the Armenian countryside. And they sort of develop a feudal relationship with the Armenians. But the Kurds actually developed some level of affection with the Armenians communities that they would ransack, whereas the Armenians clearly didn't like it, but it was sort of a feudal relationship where the Kurds would come and demand tribute every once in a while. And then the Armenian National Assembly is ripped apart, and two political parties are formed to now center Armenian political life. And these are the Hunchakians, who were social democrats or communists, and the Dashnak-Zuchun, who were more traditionalist Armenian nationalists. And so two massacres happen in the towns of Yozgat and Sasun, and these are in response to small trigger events like a fight between Armenians and Kurds. And then Kurds participate in the massacres, and there's a large, many Armenians are massacred. Usually they get played off in the media by as something like Armenian rebellion or just fights in the streets, but usually what it is there's a small trigger event, and then many Armenians are massacred by Kurds or other Turkish soldiers sometimes even. And all on anti-Ottoman sentiment that arises, Armenians just get blamed for it. And then in response to this, the Hunchaks led a march on Constantinople, but a Turkish police officer is killed in the march, and hundreds of Armenians are massacred throughout the night. And this is a big event. And over the next year, massacres happened repeatedly in Armenian villages, having this same pattern. A trigger event occurs, Armenians are blamed for it, and they're massacred by either Kurds or Turkish soldiers disguised as Kurds. So this pattern happens over and over again, and this is clearly an example of the identity rule, the conditional toleration equilibrium, where Armenians are tolerated up to an extent. And the reason that the Turkish soldiers have to disguise themselves as Kurds, or the reason that they're worried about this kind of thing, is because the West does have an eye on Turkey, and if Turkey is severely hurting Armenians or other minorities, they're not afraid to come in and defend them. So like the Russians, for example, the Russian consuls were very expressly said that they would protect Orthodox minorities, whereas the French consuls expressly said they would protect Catholic minorities, and British and American consuls expressly said that they would protect Protestant minorities. So the reason that the Turks are afraid of displaying these massacres is that they don't want to invoke the wrath of the West. And in fact, after a lot of these massacres died down, usually they gave Western diplomats tours of the countryside, but the diplomats in their memoirs say that they feel like they're being lied to by the Turks as this is going on. So then in 1913, the Young Turks rise to power, they're also known as the CUP, or the Committee for Union and Progress, and they are trying to reunite the Ottoman Empire on new grounds, and they're trying to they dismantle the Millet System, but they want to give a new identity to Ottomans to unite around. So they don't want the conditional toleration equilibrium anymore. They actually want a unified, strong nation. So what they try to do is they try to invoke sort of the legitimacy of their government based on sort of national identity. They want people to identify with being Ottoman, not just Turks, but Armenians, Greeks, Slavic people, Arabic people. They want everyone to identify as Ottoman. So now non-Muslims are allowed into the military and the bureaucracy, and here you go, they implement some compulsory education technologies, and there, a degree from these institutions is necessary to hold government positions, and you must speak Turkish to enter government positions. So they're clearly trying to do what Alessina describes in the homogenization technology paper with this with the compulsory education. But this doesn't actually work out so well for them, and the Balkans revolt, and people do not like the Turkish imposition on them. They thought that they could have sort of an Ottoman identity for anyone in the Ottoman Empire, but they forgot, as back here, they're making people speak Turkish. You can't really have a Ottoman identity with all these people are only Ottoman to the extent that the Turks oppressed them. So they don't really want to identify with Ottomanism at all. And so, yeah, as you can see, the Balkans revolt, and they are backed by the Russians. So the series of wars happened. These are called the First Balkan War, and 500,000 to 600,000 Muslim Muhacirs, which just means refugees, seek refuge in Anatolia. This is going to become very important later. So the Committee for Union and Progress, or the Young Turks, switched strategies to an exclusive Turkish nationalism. So when they realized that Ottomanism is not going to work anymore, they have to switch to Turkism, or sometimes called Turanism, where they had an idea of a fictional land of Turan that included all ethnic Turks. Its borders matched wherever a Turk was, Turan was. And that's where they wanted to expand their borders to. And so they switched their strategy from a national identity to more of a racial or ethnic identity, and that was Turkish, of course. So 100 to 200,000 Greeks were expelled from Anatolia to Greece. But the Armenians who lived in Anatolia had no homeland, unlike the Greeks. So another method had to be taken. But next year, 1914, World War I breaks out. And this is for all other kinds of reasons, but the Ottomans are dragged into it because of their alliance with the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. So Enver Pasha, who was one of the Young Turk leaders, takes the entire Third Army and moves into the Russian Caucasus to try to attack the fortress of Sarikamis. And he has not learned from history when he decided to attack Russia in the mountains in winter, and his army gets decimated. And now, at the same time, however, Armenian soldiers, some were defecting to the Russians. And so this became a very convenient scapegoat for the Turks to blame this massive failure and embarrassment to the Young Turks on Armenians who had defected. And they actually attacked some Armenians who were revolting in the village of Van nearby, who were also trying to defect to the Russians. So just the general sort of blaming Armenians and other minorities as being fifth columnists, as people that were trying to escape the Ottoman Empire and trying to support the outside regimes, really played into the whole narrative that the Western powers wanted to divide up the Ottoman Empire, and that the minorities who were rising in wealth were sort of being sellouts to the West. And so this played into their whole narrative against them. So then the actual genocide begins. On May 27th, a deportation order for Armenians was sent out, and this sort of came every few weeks. A new village was given deportation orders, and so the orders had some specific qualifications in them. One, that in the idea on the surface, all of the deportation orders were just to relocate Armenians for war purposes, or because they were being insurgents, or they were being, they were supporting the Russians or something like that. And so what it said in the instructions was that in the regions that they would be put, they would be 10% or less of the population. Also, that of the households established in a new region, there would be no more than 50 new Armenian households. And once they settle in their location, they can't move back to their old home. And a lot of these journeys were long and treacherous, and the soldiers treated people very poorly. Women were raped, children were killed, people starved and just fell and were left on the side of the road. And these are some of the most horrific stories from the genocide come from these marches. At the same time, Armenians who had recently been let into the military, or conscripted into the military rather, were transferred into labor battalions rather than fighting battalions, and then they were worked to death or just killed. So many men were already separated from their villages and unable to defend their families at the time. And often when a group was taken out of the village to be sent to the south, to the Syrian desert, the men were separated and killed separately, and then only women and children were made to march. And the second phase of the genocide included those that survived and arrived in Aleppo, and then many Armenians were sent to new homes in that region that I mentioned earlier in the Syrian desert. And this was clearly not intended to be somewhere where they actually lived, but it was intended to be somewhere that they would stay to die. So whether or not Armenians in fact settled was outside of the concern of the perpetrators of the genocide, because this area in Syria would soon not even become part of their territory. They didn't care. The Armenians were there. If they died or not, it didn't matter to them. So this again is that same map. So in the region down here, this is where many Armenians were sent to be killed from many of these regions. So imagine all of these regions, most of the people were shipped out down here and died in this region. And then the blue escaped. And if you notice, what I found interesting was that where they were sent, because of the 10% rule and 50 household rule, that might explain part of the reason that the higher population areas had a also higher percentage of people killed, because if you're thinking in terms of Alesina's argument, what they're trying to do is trying to get the non-Turks down to a certain absolute level so that they have no sort of political clout or voting power if you're in a democratic situation. So if you're thinking like the Turks were and you're trying to eliminate these people as a political faction, what you want to do is get them down to a certain absolute level. So in these western regions where there's already plenty of Armenians, rather where there's very few Armenians, you don't care if you kill as many because they already weren't really a faction. Such as in this region here, about 98% of them just remained in the province. They didn't really mind the Armenians that lived there, whereas the Armenians that lived here would have been a major voting base, I guess you could call it, or at the very least a political faction. So returning to this model, what I'm going to be looking at quickly is these three variables, and this one as well, or rather three of these variables. I'm assuming that the military costs just remain the same. So the great powers, these being the West. So the rise of the West in this instance was the exogenous shock that ended the conditional toleration equilibrium in the Ottoman Empire. So state capacity needed to grow in order to prevent the empire from being partitioned, and the West assisted minorities in growing economically and ideologically into a force the Ottomans were concerned with. So two things happen. When the West becomes a military threat, all of a sudden the low state capacity that characterized the early Ottoman Empire isn't going to fit anymore. They need some way to increase their state capacity to defend against the West, and also there's a lot of heterogeneity, and it's much harder to enforce identity rules against these minorities, which are growing and growing and growing in economic and intellectual and cultural prowess. Also, after World War I was in full swing, the West no longer had the leverage over the Ottomans to protect minorities as they had in Abdulhamid's time. So even though they did cover up what they were doing in the genocide, it didn't matter as much if they were killing many, many, many people, and they weren't fearing the retaliation of the West on the margin, because the West was already attacking them. So when they're already in the midst of World War I, not only can they play this whole thing off as a sort of a wartime movement of people, but also even if the British are already throwing everything they've got at them, so they can't throw more than they've got at them, so they're not worried about anything worse than already what's going on happened. So this variable R, which would include the retaliation of the great powers, decreases. And also, so the recognition that Ottomanism failed, this solidified in the minds of the CUP that homogenization was going to be necessary for a new nation to be built and for a strong state to grow on this nation, a strong nation to grow. They couldn't run with the Ottomanism thesis anymore. They couldn't have the sort of civic nationalism of Ottomanism. They, for one reason or another, weren't going with the general toleration. And so in their minds, the gains from homogenization is the only option. So that becomes sort of front and center what they want to do. There is an idea that I find really interesting from one of the sources that I was reading, that when the West sort of would claim things like, we're going to be watching out for these people because of their human rights, or we're watching out for the Armenians and Greeks or the minorities in the Ottoman Empire because of something like universal human rights. This is sort of an appeal to general rules, but what the Ottomans noticed was that they would always talk a big talk about human rights when it came to Christians in the Ottoman Empire, but when Muslims were being killed in the Greek War of Independence or the Balkan War of Independence, the West was ominously silent on human rights. So the Turks knew what game the West was playing, and they saw that the human rights weren't really a general rule. They were actually just an identity rule in general rule clothing. So if the Ottomans all of a sudden started playing general rules, it would be like bringing a knife to a gunfight. So they kind of had to counter identity rules with identity rules. And third, And because of this, the gains from homogenization in the eyes of the Turks increases. And the Muhacirs, who are the refugees, think back to the Alisina's paper on the number and size of nations. They're very concerned with population. So the question is, even if it's more costly, why would they go with a genocide over some other kind of homogenization technology? You're losing a lot of your population. Isn't that, counter the whole point of having this large nation state that's not splitting up? Well, in this case, there are plenty of refugees from the Balkan Wars moving in that are Muslim and are much easier to just sort of integrate with Turkish Muslim society than the Armenians that were already living there were. So this means that sort of the marginal value of P decreases. So you can think of it as, let's say you have 1 million people in your population. If there's a genocide without, if you have a genocide without the sort of a new set of people coming in, then you go from 1 million to 750,000. This might be a major blow to your economy. But if you remain at 1 million, it's not that big of a difference. But then you might be asking, oh well, don't they want the refugees to come in and they keep the people, the original people that they're like the Armenians that they're not killing now? Well, yes. So having 1,250,000 would be better, but on the margin, it doesn't matter so much. So there is a question of diminishing marginal utility to that desire for more and more population. As the population gets larger, the marginal member of the population matters less to that sort of political economy consideration. So simply as a conclusion, P decreases, R decreases, and Hg increases. So it's far more likely that Hg is greater than all the costs. So it is much more makes much more sense that they would commit a genocide. And this isn't sort of a definitive that they would commit genocide under this condition. So if this condition is met, doesn't mean a genocide will occur. It just means that they're sort of it's within their budget constraint, in a sense, in their perceived budget constraint. So these are some further topics of interest. What happened with Kemal Ataturk and the Turkish independence movement soon after? What is the relationship between the Kurds and the Turks? How much did religion play into the massacres? And the relation between the Kurds and the Turks since, and other religious and ethnic minorities in the Ottoman Empire. And sort of an interesting question would be, did the Turks and the Kurds, the Turks sort of made the Kurds their pawn and sort of a temporary ally for the time, but today the Kurds and the Turks are not on very good terms. So what caused that? And some might say that it's just a process of, even though they legitimized themselves on a sort of Turkish creed during the war, they couldn't kill the Armenians and the Kurds at the same time, so they made a temporary alliance with the Kurds, and then as time has gone on, they've sort of continued the plan sort of post hoc, and so now the alienation or integration and elimination of the Kurdish identity is sort of playing out slowly and more over time. So this is a simple map of language in Anatolia, and as you can see, Turkish and Kurdish are the largest language. I think there is a little bit of Armenian on this map, maybe? Not even. Nope, not even any. No Armenian, no Greek, a little bit of Arabic, and some Kurdish. But yeah, so that's the sort of language map of Turkey today. And thank you. These are all the people that have helped in various ways in the project. If you enjoyed this video or you would enjoy content similar to this, let me know. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And thanks for listening. Bye.